What would you do if you grew up believing that success belonged to other people? What if every day of your childhood reminded you that you were poor? What if the world around you constantly told you that people like you never escape? Would you accept your fate? Or would you spend your entire life trying to prove everyone wrong? Because one man did, and that's why millions of people around the world begin their mornings with a cup of coffee bearing the logo of the company he built. His name is Howard Schultz, and this isn't just the story of Starbucks. This is the story of poverty, rejection, risk, failure, and a dream so unbelievable that almost nobody believed it could work. Imagine growing up in a small apartment in a public housing complex in Brooklyn, New York. The walls are thin. The money is gone before the month ends. Your parents work hard, but somehow it's never enough. That was Howard Schultz's childhood. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't born into opportunity. He was born into struggle. Have you ever watched someone you love suffer and felt powerless to help? Howard did. Howard's father worked difficult jobs: truck driver, factory worker, delivery worker, whatever he could find. But then, one day, everything changed. His father fell and injured himself while working, and then something happened that Howard Schultz would never forget. His father lost his income. There was no compensation, no health care, no support, nothing. Imagine watching your family fall apart financially because one accident changed everything. Imagine being a child and realizing that the world isn't fair. That experience would haunt Howard Schultz for the rest of his life. Because sometimes the pain we experience as children becomes the fuel for our greatest dreams. Howard promised himself something. One day he would escape poverty. One day he would build something different. One day he would create a company that treated people better than his father had been treated. But dreams are easy. Reality is difficult. Howard wasn't the smartest student. He wasn't the richest. He didn't have connections. He had one thing: determination. And sometimes determination is enough. He became the first person in his family to attend college. Think about that. The first. Can you imagine the pressure, the fear, the responsibility? Every step felt impossible, but Howard continued because he understood something powerful. The only guaranteed failure is the one you never attempt. After college, Howard worked various jobs. He sold products. He learned business. He studied people. And then one day, something happened that would change his life forever. He discovered a small coffee company in Seattle, a company called Starbucks. At the time, Starbucks wasn't famous, it wasn't global, it wasn't a billion-dollar company. It was just a small business selling coffee beans. But Howard Schultz saw something that nobody else could see: potential. Dreams often begin that way. Not with certainty, but with vision. Howard joined Starbucks, and then he traveled to Italy. That trip changed everything, because what he saw there would eventually transform the coffee industry forever. But nobody around him believed it. And that rejection would become the beginning of one of the greatest business stories ever told. To be continued.
Imagine discovering an idea so powerful that you can't stop thinking about it. An idea so clear that you can almost see the future, but everyone around you thinks you're crazy. What would you do? Would you trust yourself, or would you trust the people telling you that you're wrong? Because that's exactly what happened to Howard Schultz. In the early 1980s, Howard traveled to Italy. At first, it was just a business trip, but what he experienced there would change his life forever. He walked through the streets of Milan. He noticed something unusual. Coffee wasn't just a drink, it was an experience. People gathered in cafes, they talked, they laughed, they built friendships, they built communities. The coffee shop wasn't a store, it was a destination, a third place, not home, not work, something in between. And in that moment, Howard Schultz saw the future. Have you ever had an idea hit you so hard that you couldn't sleep? That was Howard. He returned to Seattle full of excitement. He couldn't wait to tell everyone. He believed Starbucks could become something extraordinary, not just a place that sold coffee beans, but a place where people gathered, a place that created human connection, a place that changed culture itself. But then something happened. The founders of Starbucks disagreed. They didn't want to build cafes. They didn't want to become what Howard envisioned. They believed Starbucks should remain a coffee retailer. Imagine that moment. You discover the idea of your lifetime. You know in your heart it will work. And the people in charge tell you, no. What would you do? Would you accept their decision? Would you abandon your dream? Howard couldn't, because once you've seen your future, it's impossible to pretend you haven't. And so he made one of the most terrifying decisions of his life. He left Starbucks. Think about that. He walked away from the company he loved, not because he hated it, but because he believed in something bigger. He started his own company, a small coffee business inspired by what he had experienced in Italy. He called it Il Giornale. And then came the hardest part, money. He needed investors, he needed believers, he needed people willing to trust a dream that didn't yet exist. Instead, he found rejection again and again and again. Howard Schultz pitched his vision to hundreds of people. Most of them said no. Some thought he was unrealistic. Some thought coffee shops were a terrible business. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being told over and over again that your dream is impossible. Could you continue? Could you keep believing when nobody else did? Howard Schultz did. He reportedly faced rejection from more than 200 investors. 200. Think about that number. Most people quit after one rejection. Many quit after 5. Some survived 10. Howard Schultz survived hundreds because he understood something extraordinary. Rejection isn't proof that you're wrong. Sometimes it's proof that you're early. And then something unbelievable happened. Slowly, a few people began to believe, not because Howard had guarantees, not because he had proof, because they believed in him. And sometimes, before the world believes in your dream, someone must first believe in you. Howard raised enough money. He opened his coffee shops, and something incredible happened. People loved them, not because of the coffee alone, but because of the feeling, the experience, the community. The dream was becoming reality. But Howard Schultz's biggest opportunity and greatest risk was still coming, because soon he would have the chance to buy Starbucks itself, and he would risk everything to do it. To be continued.
How much would you risk for a dream? Your savings, your career, your reputation. What if achieving your dream required risking everything you've already built? Would you do it? Because that's exactly what Howard Schultz did. By the mid-1980s, his small coffee company, Il Giornale, was beginning to succeed. People loved the experience. They loved the atmosphere. They loved the idea that coffee could be more than just a drink. For the first time in years, Howard felt something he had felt only once before. Hope. Real hope. Imagine walking into one of your own stores. Customers are smiling, people are talking, friends are meeting, strangers are becoming regulars, and you realize that the impossible idea everyone laughed at is actually working. Can you imagine that feeling? After years of rejection, after hundreds of people told you no, to finally know that you were right. Most people would have stopped there. Most people would have protected their success. But Howard Schultz wasn't interested in small dreams. He was interested in changing the world. Then, something unbelievable happened. The founders of Starbucks decided, how much would you risk for a dream? Your savings, your career, your reputation. What if achieving your dream required risking everything you've already built? Would you do it? Because that's exactly what Howard Schultz did. By the mid-1980s, his small coffee company, Il Giornale, was beginning to succeed. People loved the experience. They loved the atmosphere. They loved the idea that coffee could be more than just a drink. For the first time in years, Howard felt something he had felt only once before. Hope. Real hope. Imagine walking into one of your own stores. Customers are smiling, people are talking, friends are meeting, strangers are becoming regulars, and you realize that the impossible idea everyone laughed at is actually working. Can you imagine that feeling? After years of rejection, after hundreds of people told you no, to finally know that you were right. Most people would have stopped there. Most people would have protected their success. But Howard Schultz wasn't interested in small dreams. He was interested in changing the world. Then, something unbelievable happened. The founders of Starbucks decided they wanted to sell the company. Think about that moment. The company that once rejected Howard's vision, the company he had left behind, the company he had never stopped believing in, was suddenly available. Imagine hearing that news. Your heart races, your mind fills with possibilities, and then reality arrives. The price. Starbucks cost millions of dollars, much more than Howard Schultz had, much more. What would you do? Would you walk away? Would you tell yourself it wasn't meant to be? Howard Schultz made a different decision. He decided to fight for his dream, again. He traveled, he met investors, he explained his vision. He asked people to believe in something that didn't exist yet. And once again, many people said no. Can you imagine how exhausting that must have been? To spend years hearing rejection, to finally achieve success, and then to begin the rejection process all over again. But Howard had learned something. Persistence creates possibility, and possibility changes lives. Slowly, painfully, he raised the money, not because people believed in coffee, because some people believed in him. And in 1987, Howard Schultz bought Starbucks. Think about that. The employee who left because nobody believed his dream returned to buy the company itself. That's not business, that's belief. That's courage, that's persistence. But perhaps the most incredible part of the story was what happened next. Because Howard Schultz didn't want to build a coffee company. He wanted to build a culture, a community, a place where people felt they belonged. He called it the third place, not home, not work, something in between, a place for human connection. At the time, many people thought the idea was ridiculous. Why would anyone spend extra money on coffee? Why would anyone sit in a coffee shop for hours? Why would anyone care? Have you noticed how often revolutionary ideas sound foolish at first? History is filled with ideas that everyone dismissed until they changed the world. Howard Schultz expanded slowly, then faster still. Stores opened across America. Customers returned. Communities formed. The dream that nobody believed in was becoming a movement. And then something happened that changed everything. Starbucks didn't just become successful, it became part of people's lives, part of their mornings, part of their conversations, part of their identity. The boy who grew up in public housing, the son of a struggling worker, the man rejected by hundreds of investors, was building one of the most recognized brands in the world. But Howard Schultz's greatest challenge wasn't behind him, because success brings something that failure never does: the fear of losing everything you've built. And that challenge would test him more than anyone expected. To be continued.
What happens after you achieve your dream? Do you finally feel safe? Do you finally stop worrying? Or does success create a new kind of fear? Because that's exactly what happened to Howard Schultz. By the early 1990s, Starbucks was no longer a small coffee company. It was becoming something much bigger. Stores were opening everywhere. Customers were lining up. Investors were paying attention. The dream that hundreds of people had rejected was now becoming impossible to ignore. Think about that. The same idea that people called unrealistic, the same dream that investors laughed at, was transforming American culture. Can you imagine how that felt? To remember every rejection, every meeting, every person who told you no, and then watch millions of people embrace the very idea they said would never work. But success creates a dangerous question. What if I lose everything? Have you ever noticed that failure and success create different kinds of fear? When you're failing, you're afraid you'll never succeed. When you're succeeding, you're afraid you'll lose what you've built. And Howard Schultz understood that fear because he had lived through poverty. He had watched his family struggle. He had watched his father lose everything, and those memories never disappeared. In fact, they became one of the most important reasons behind his success, because Howard made a promise to himself when he was young. If he ever built a company, he would treat people differently. He would create the kind of company his father never had, a company that cared. Think about that. The pain of his childhood didn't make him bitter. It made him compassionate. And perhaps that's one of the greatest transformations a human being can experience, turning pain into purpose. So Howard Schultz did something that many business leaders thought was impossible. He offered benefits to employees who worked part-time: health insurance, support, respect. Many people said he was making a mistake. They said it would cost too much. They said it would hurt profits. They said business wasn't supposed to work that way. Have you heard that before? You can't do that. It won't work. It's impossible. Howard Schultz had heard those words his entire life, and he ignored them again. Because he remembered his father. He remembered watching a hard-working man lose everything because nobody protected him.
and he decided that his company would be different. Then something unbelievable happened. Starbucks continued growing, not despite treating people well, because of it. Employees believed in the company, customers believed in the company, communities believed in the company. And suddenly, Starbucks wasn't just selling coffee, it was selling belonging. Imagine creating something that becomes part of millions of people's daily lives. Their first meeting, their first date, their morning routine, their conversation with a friend, their moment of peace. That's what Howard Schultz built. Not coffee, connection. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Starbucks had become a global phenomenon. Stores opened around the world. The green logo became one of the most recognized symbols on Earth. The boy who grew up in public housing had become a billionaire. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of the story wasn't the money, it wasn't the fame, it wasn't the empire. It was the fact that he never forgot where he came from. Because the greatest leaders don't forget their struggles, they use them. And Howard Schultz's greatest lesson was only now becoming clear. To be continued.
What is the true purpose of success? Is it to become rich? Is it to become famous? Is it to prove everyone wrong? Or is it to make sure that the people who come after you suffer less than you did? Because if there's one thing Howard Schultz understood, it was this: success means nothing if you forget why you wanted it in the first place. By the early 2000s, Starbucks had become one of the most successful companies in the world. Thousands of stores, millions of customers, billions of dollars. The dream that more than 200 investors had rejected was now changing how the entire world drank coffee. Think about that. The poor boy from Brooklyn, the son of a struggling worker, the man who had once begged people to believe in his vision, was now leading one of the most recognized brands on earth. Most people would have felt invincible, but Howard Schultz remembered something. He remembered his father. He remembered the day his father got injured. He remembered watching his family struggle. He remembered what it felt like to be powerless. And because he remembered, he made different choices. Howard believed that business should be about more than profit. He believed companies should care about people, not because it was popular, not because it was profitable, because it was right. Imagine building a company and deciding that human dignity matters more than short-term gain. Many people called him naive. Others called him unrealistic. Some investors believed he cared too much. Have you noticed something? The people who change the world are often criticized for caring too much about people, too much about quality, too much about purpose. But perhaps that's exactly why they change the world. Howard Schultz continued expanding Starbucks around the globe: Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. The company became a symbol recognized almost everywhere. But then something happened, something that happens to many successful companies. Growth became faster than purpose. Expansion became faster than culture. And Howard Schultz began to worry. Imagine creating something you love, watching it become successful, then realizing that success itself might destroy the very thing you built. What would you do? Would you ignore the problem? Would you protect your image? Or would you risk everything again? Because Howard Schultz chose to risk everything. In 2008, Starbucks faced one of the most difficult periods in its history. Sales declined, stores struggled, customers changed, critics believed the company had lost its soul. The world that once admired Starbucks began asking a painful question. Was the magic gone? And once again, Howard Schultz found himself facing something familiar. Fear, failure, uncertainty. Think about how extraordinary that is. After becoming a billionaire, after building a global empire, he was once again confronting the possibility of losing everything. Because success doesn't eliminate struggle, it simply changes its form. Howard returned to lead Starbucks once more. He closed stores, he retrained employees, he reminded the company why it existed, not to sell coffee, but to create connection, to create community, to create humanity. And slowly, something incredible happened. Starbucks recovered, the company grew stronger, the culture returned, and once again, Howard Schultz proved something extraordinary. Leadership isn't about avoiding failure, it's about having the courage to confront it again and again and again. Because the greatest leaders never stop fighting for what they believe. And perhaps that was Howard Schultz's greatest lesson of all.
What if the most important thing you build in life isn't a company? What if it isn't money? What if it isn't fame? What if the most important thing you build is hope? Because that's exactly what Howard Schultz built. Today, billions of people recognize the Starbucks name. They see the coffee, the stores, the logo, the global empire. But most people don't see the little boy growing up in public housing in Brooklyn. They don't see the child watching his father lose everything. They don't see the young man who believed that life was unfair. And they don't see the entrepreneur who heard no hundreds of times. Think about that. The world remembers success, but success is only the final chapter. The real story is everything that happened before. Howard Schultz understood something that many people spend their entire lives trying to learn. Your past does not determine your future. Your circumstances do not define your destiny. Your failures do not decide your value. You do. Imagine if Howard Schultz had accepted the limitations of his childhood. Imagine if he had decided that people from poor neighborhoods don't build global companies. Imagine if he had believed the investors who told him that his dream was impossible. Imagine if he had listened when people laughed at the idea of paying extra money for coffee. There would be no Starbucks, no global brand, no empire, no inspiration for millions of people. And perhaps that's why his story matters so much, because his story isn't really about coffee. It's about belief. It's about courage. It's about refusing to accept the life that others expect you to live. Have you ever felt like your circumstances were too difficult, like your dream was too big, like everyone else had advantages that you didn't? Howard Schultz understood that feeling. He lived it. He grew up with it. He fought against it, and eventually he overcame it. Not because he was lucky, not because he was born wealthy, not because success was easy, but because he refused to quit. And perhaps that's the hidden truth behind every extraordinary success story. Persistence is more powerful than talent. Belief is more powerful than fear. And purpose is more powerful than failure. Howard Schultz once said that when you're surrounded by people who share a passionate commitment around a common purpose, anything is possible. Think about those words. Anything. Not some things, not easy things, anything. Because extraordinary people don't wait for permission to dream. They don't wait for certainty. They don't wait until fear disappears. They move forward anyway. Today, Starbucks exists in countries all around the world. Millions of people begin their day inside a company that was once only a dream rejected by more than 200 investors, a dream that almost nobody believed, except one person, Howard Schultz. The boy who grew up poor, the man who refused to give up, the entrepreneur who transformed rejection into opportunity. And perhaps that's why his story will continue to inspire people for generations. Because every time someone feels like quitting, every time someone believes they're not good enough, every time someone thinks their dream is impossible, they can remember Howard Schultz. They can remember that poverty is not destiny, rejection is not defeat, failure is not final. Because every company, every billionaire, every empire, every legend started with a dream, and every legend started from zero. And perhaps so can you.